The Judiciary Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time, and the clerk will call the roll to establish a quorum.
Mr. Smith?
Present.
Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Coble? Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Issa? Mr. Pence? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. Franks? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Griffin? Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Ross? Ms. Adams? Mr. Quayle? Mr. Amade? Mr. Conyers? Mr. Berman? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Scott? Mr. Watt? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Waters? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Quigley? Ms. Chu? Mr. Deutsch? Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Polis?
Are there additional members who wish to record their presence? Clerk report.
Mr. Chairman, 8 members responded present.
Is that all we need for a working quorum?
Just hang tight. We need about 5 more members.
Okay. But we'll just keep it open here for a couple of minutes till we get 5 more members. Are you recorded, Bobby?
I am, thank you. How are you doing?
Oh, Mr. Scott, looking at the but not aimlessly, always with you.
You recorded? Mr. Franks, you're recorded. Mr. Pierluisi?
Chu.
Okay, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is present. The gentleman from Puerto Rico, present. Okay, gentlewoman from California, gentleman from Illinois, gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren. Okay. Gentlewoman from another gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu. And gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross. And Trent is here. Okay. We have, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 14 members responded present.
Our working quorum is present, so we will proceed now to the amendment that we were considering yesterday when votes were called, and it was an amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, and the gentleman from Arizona. I had finished offering the amendment, and it was the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, who was in the process of responding to that amendment, so the gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm having a bit of trouble with this amendment, but I think that it greatly broadens the right to sue. The bill limits suits to violations of subsection A2, which is the use of, quote, force or the threat of force to intentionally injure or intimidate any person for the purpose of coercing a sex selection or race selection abortion, close quote. The gentleman's amendment now says that, quote, a woman upon whom an abortion has been performed pursuant to a violation of subsection A2 may, in a civil action against any person who engaged in a violation of subsection A, obtain appropriate relief, unquote. First, I'm not at all clear what the word pursuant means in this context. Black's Law Dictionary defines pursuant to as either in compliance with, in accordance with, or as authorized by. So I have no idea what an abortion performed pursuant to a violation of law could possibly be. Maybe authorized by a violation of law. I just don't know what the amendment means here. Second, the cause of action seems no longer to be limited to subsection A2. It now applies to all of subsection A. Subsection A2 is someone who coercively performs an abortion for certain purposes. Section A does not need coercion. It applies to anyone who performs an abortion, anyone who solicits or accepts funds for the performance of an abortion or transports a woman into the U.S. or across state lines to obtain an abortion. That's not a clarification. That's a tremendous expansion of the causes of action, and the people might be sued. The amendment is unclear in part and broadens a bad policy to even more ludicrous dimensions. So first of all, I hope that we can clarify what pursuant to means and how it changes the meaning of the original bill. And second of all, I urge the defeat of the amendment insofar as it broadens what the bill purports to do. I yield back. And I would, before I yield back, I would ask, can we get the intent of what pursuant to is supposed to mean here, what the amendment is trying to do? Because it frankly doesn't seem to. It either does nothing or it does something, and I'm not clear what.
Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I'll yield myself 5 minutes to say that I support the amendment, and I will yield to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, sincerely, this is meant to make sure that the coerced woman has the same action capability as those others mentioned in the bill, the civil action by relatives. It was just an ambiguity there, where the original intent of the bill was to give the coerced woman the chance to pursue civil action on all 4 of the paragraphs under Section A. If you look at that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes.
The language of the bill, without the amendment, a woman upon, on page 14, a woman upon whom an abortion has been performed or attempted in violation of subsection A2, that is coercively, may in a civil action against any person who engaged in the violation obtain appropriate relief. How is that not clear already?
Well, it only references Section A2, and if you look at that, it doesn't give her the ability to deal with the same. If you look on line 7, page 14, if you'll notice, in violation of subsection A, it would mean that grandparents or others would have a greater flexibility to have civil action than the mother who had been coerced. And all we wanted to do was to make the field even there. And the pursuant to just means as a result of.
It doesn't matter. I yield back.
The gentleman from Arizona has the time. Does he yield back?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, are there any other members who wish to be recognized on the amendment? If not, the gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, then I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, nay. In opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Record vote, please.
Record vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes aye. Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Issa? Mr. Pence? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes aye. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Amade? Mr. Conyers? Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Berman? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Waters? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes no. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes no. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Mr. Polis?
Chairman.
The gentleman from Wisconsin.
Aye.
Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Gallagly votes aye.
Another gentleman from California.
Mr. Lundgren votes
Third gentleman from California.
Mr. Issa votes aye.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes in the back.
Mr. Forbes votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members voted aye, 10 members voted nay.
Okay. Majority having voted in favor of the amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the
Gentleman
desk.
from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, is recognized to offer an amendment. And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3541, offered by Mr. Conyers of Michigan. Page 2, beginning in line 2.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Michigan is recognized to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman and members, Uh, I've been troubled by the title of this bill from the beginning, and this amendment is an effort to strike the names Susan Anthony and Frederick Douglass from the Prenatal Non-Discrimination Act. The names of two great civil rights pioneers have been put on the short title of this bill, and as one who has perhaps studied and appreciated Frederick Douglass as much as anyone on the committee, I have not been able to discover what his name on this bill and his connection to it are. And I think the same thing applies to this great women's rights advocate, Susan B. Anthony. So it's in this spirit that we at least accurately entitle this bill. But to use these two people on the bill, I think, is very misleading and sets up a very bad policy. And what I want to do is get, I hope, to the position where we can work on some of the problems when it comes to access to family planning services. The African American and Hispanic communities are underserved when it comes to prenatal care and to maternal and child health care services. African Americans have shorter lifespans, higher infant mortality rates, higher rates of low birth weight babies. By every measure, our community is medically underserved, and the outcomes only reinforce that. And so those are the issues I would like to direct our attention toward. And I think that in some ways, the measure before us signifies an important retreat from civil rights initiatives. And it's in this sense that I hope you will join me in removing these two great Americans' names from the title. And I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conyers. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodline, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want it noted in the record that I was on the previous recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks. I was unavoidably detained. Had I been present, I would have voted aye for the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Okay, let me check on the, are there other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, there's a great deal of respect on my part toward the gentleman offering the amendment, and I if you'll bear with me here, I'll try to respond to the gentleman's concern. Naming this bill or using the namesake of Frederick Douglass was, in my estimation, an honor to his life. This abolitionist's life's work was about eradicating slavery, working to save and enrich the lives of the African American people, men, women, and children alike, so that they could enjoy that which we all are promised in America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I don't know that there could be a greater namesake for the bill, and I would certainly oppose changing it, and certainly for the same reason Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights, women's equality. And I have just want to submit for the record a letter of endorsement for Prenda from the Frederick Douglass Foundation. And I want to say this very sincerely. This letter is dated June 25th, 2010, and did not anticipate Mr. Conyers' amendment at all. There's no response here. This was something that was done a long time ago. And if I could, the heading of the letter has a quote by Frederick Douglass. He said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." And the letter is addressed to me. It's to Dear Congressman Franks. I won't read the whole letter, but it said the prenatal...
Chairman, may we request a copy of the letter?
Certainly. I'm going to, if with your permission,
Could we
Mr. Chairman,
see it?
I would be glad to do that, and I would like to offer it as a...
Before you decide not to include all of it?
I would like to include all of it in the record, if I could.
And without objection, both the letters referred to by the gentleman will be made a
Reserving the
part of
right
the
to
record.
object, Mr. Chairman, because we don't have a copy of it. How could we evaluate whether to put it in the record? I'm asking for a copy of it before it be put in the record. I mean, I obviously don't...
We'll be happy to pass copies around to you, sir. I'm asking the staff to do that now.
Does the gentleman from North Carolina still object to the inclusion
I
of the letter?
reserve the right to object until I see the letter, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I'll have a few more things to say here in the meantime, if it's all right, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, to use the rest of my time here.
Yeah. Let me just say to the gentleman from North Carolina that the inclusion of documents in the record has always been a courtesy that has been extended to all members on both sides virtually for any reason. And I would not like that tradition to necessarily be
Mr. Chairman,
interrupted.
and I thoroughly respect that, but it also has been the tradition to make the letters available, or whatever is going into the record, available if somebody wants it.
I'm not sure that has been a tradition, but in any case, we'll see that the gentleman has a copy of the letter.
I want to assure the chairman I'm not trying to break that tradition. I think essentially whatever people want to put in the record ought to be allowed to be put into the record. And ultimately, I'm not going to continue the objection, but if he's going to quote and say, I'm going to read part of the letter, I think we're entitled to see the letter. With respect to anything that goes into the record, we are entitled to see it.
The chairman does not question what the gentleman is entitled to do. I was referring to simply past precedent on the committee and the tradition that the gentleman himself just recognized. I'll take the gentleman at his word that he doesn't intend to object, but I also will look forward to his reading the letter. The gentleman from Arizona continues to have the time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the reality here is that if one just looks at present statistics, and I'll try to make this as concise as I can, according to Alan Guttmacher, about 37% of the 1.2 million abortions a year in America are on African American babies, about 444,000. The challenge with that statistic, sir, is that we have a complete record of births of African American children being about 620,000 per year, but many of the states, in terms of their abortion statistics, are left out. When one corrects in the most conservative way we can think of doing so, that means that the floor is around 42%. The floor, around 42% of all African Americans are aborted before they're born. Now, I would stipulate, I know that the former chairman suggested that in another hearing that Mr. Douglas never opined on Roe versus Wade. And I would suggest that, I'll stipulate to that. But to suggest that this man who fought for equality would not be outraged at 42% or more of African Americans being aborted before they're born, I think is a terrible disservice to him. And I know it's not one that the gentleman offers. But I am convinced that this honors the name of Frederick Douglass and continues the great work he did to see that all of God's children, no matter who they are, get an equal chance at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Franks, and without objection,
Move to strike the last word.
First of all, without objection, the two letters that the gentleman from Arizona referred to would be made a part of the record. The gentleman from North Carolina.
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I really came to this markup without the intent to be involved in it because I was so insulted by the use of these two giants' names that just the, and now I'm insulted because we've had our whole committee misrepresented the fact that somehow this foundation has authorized or the use of the name. There's nothing in this letter that says that they authorized the use of their name on the Frederick Douglass name on this legislation. To insult, I mean, we don't know what position Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony would have had on this legislation. I think it is just an absolute insult to these people to be trying to tie them to this movement that Mr. Franks professes to be leading the band on. We ought to name the bill the Frank whatever it is. I mean, you know, name it in favor of yourself. We know what you stand for. But you don't have a clue what Frederick Douglass stood for when it comes to this issue. We know none of us believe in discrimination, and that's what the letter says.
Right.
That's really all the letter says when you get right down to it. But this is an insult to the memory of two giants in our history. To try to drag them down into some current day debate about whether abortion or life begins at conception or viability, when that wasn't even an issue when they were around, is just an abomination, in my opinion. And I just, and then to be insulted by saying that the letter stands for the proposition that that their name should be used on this legislation is a further insult to me and the members of this committee. Mr. Chairman,
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield. Maybe I can bring myself to compose myself at what's being done here in this committee. This is an abomination. I'll yield to the gentleman.
And I thank you for your passion and the deep feeling that you have that these two leaders for human decency would have their names posthumously attached to legislation that is not at all clear that they'd support. I asked you to yield, Chairman Watts, because the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights has sent a letter to the members of the House Judiciary Committee, a coalition of over 200 organizations dedicated to ending discrimination in all aspects of American life. And they urge us to oppose this bill, H.R. 3541, and because it does not in any way address discrimination on the basis of sex or race, rather it is a veiled attempt to restrict health care for women of color under the guise of civil rights. And so I will, at the appropriate time, ask unanimous consent that this letter be introduced into the record, and I thank you for your...
Reclaiming my time.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to simply state I wholeheartedly support the bill, but I am inclined to support Chairman Conyers' amendment. I think some things are worth arguing, and the content of a bill and the discussion that we have should be a vigorous one, but the title is certainly something we can be sensitive on both sides of the aisle to. I think if somebody is offended or has objection to that, that is certainly something that, as a professional courtesy, we should take care of, and I would be inclined to support Chairman Conyers.
I ask
yield
unanimous
back.
consent for 2 additional minutes, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, if it's all right, would be recognized. We're going to have, let me just say to the gentleman from North Carolina, we are not going to conclude debate on this amendment. We're going to go vote and then return. So if it's all right, I'd like to have some other members speak before we go. The gentleman without objection is recognized for an additional minute.
Let me yield to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this bill is not the only thing that appropriates a name without permission, apparently. I just Googled the Frederick Douglass Foundation. Their homepage describes themselves as follows. The Frederick Douglass Foundation is a national grassroots public policy and educational organization which brings the sanctity of free market and limited government ideas to bear on the hardest problems facing our nation. Our goals, by being a liaison to black faith-based organizations, conservative candidates, party, and elected officials. And it goes on. So it's a conservative organization. It's entitled to be, but it certainly doesn't necessarily represent the views of Frederick Douglass or what he might think today. So to use this letter in anything, all this says is that a conservative organization, which presents itself as a conservative policy organization, agrees with the bill, which is not surprising. So I also think that this is, we should not be appropriating the names of people who we have no idea what they're
Reclaiming my time just long enough to ask the ranking member whether he might agree to a friendly amendment to his amendment that changes the name of the bill to the Trent Franks bill. I don't care if we use his name. You know, it's the insult to the memory of these people that I'm concerned about.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, is
Thank you, Mr.
recognized.
Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I listened to this debate, and curiously, it's coming sometimes from people that weren't going to be engaged in the debate. And the gentleman from North Carolina, when he says that discussion about the debate on when life begins, I actually don't think it is the subject of this bill. But whether we agree or disagree on when life begins, I think we can agree that life ends at abortion. And this bill is targeted at race and sex selection of babies for abortion. And then as I listened to some of the other discussion and debate about whether or not we can take offense on behalf of people long since passed away, such as Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, you know, I don't know how we can posture ourselves in that fashion and decide we're going to be opposed to an amendment to the title in a bill because somebody professes to be offended or potentially offended on behalf of someone who is checked into the next life. And so I believe that we are very, very consistent with Susan B. Anthony and the principles that she lived and stood for, and I think we're very, very consistent with Frederick Douglass. And to make that point more emphatically than myself, I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Arizona.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. I don't want to belabor this. I would just suggest to you that if we can't hearken back to the heroes of the past that have stood for things like fighting discrimination and protecting all classes of people to further the same cause today, then we have to take all these pictures down here in the walls and just forget about any comments of tying a George Washington to freedom or the founding of America. I mean, the bottom line is that Mr. Douglass fought to preserve the African American people in this country when they were being persecuted in the worst possible ways. And yet the reality is today that 14 million African American children have been aborted in this country since Roe versus Wade. 14 million, which far outpaces the death caused even in the days of slavery. And I would just suggest to you that if we're looking for an abomination here, there it is, when 42% or more African Americans are aborted, and that's what this bill seeks to purport. Now, if it's a notion that we need to deal with underserved people, let me just say to you, if Planned Parenthood and the abortion industry continues to serve the underserved like they've been doing, pretty soon there won't be any underserved to serve.
Will the gentleman yield?
And with that, I would
Mr.
yield
Chairman,
back.
I'm trying to...
The gentleman yields back his time.
Reclaiming my time.
The
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you're right. The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, has the
Thank,
time.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd conclude my statement having reclaimed my time. And I have in front of me a letter from the Frederick Douglass Foundation. Not having just Googled it, but I have it actually in print in front of me. And it says it's a letter actually to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks. And it says, in part, it is most disturbing to think that anyone would be allowed to terminate the life of the baby because of their race or gender. That is discrimination in its purest form, just as heinous as the Jim Crow laws. That's the letter in part. I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce it into the record, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman, the entire letter has already been made.
Mr.
a part of the
Chairman.
record. The gentleman's time has expired. The committee is going to stand in recess until immediately after this series of 2 votes, which will be in about 20 minutes. I would expect to resume markup. The Judiciary Committee will resume markup of H.R. 3541. And the amendment by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, is currently under discussion. And
We only have 10 right now, so we can't.
we may have some in the back. But
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent the committee recess subject to the call of the chair.
yeah, would the gentleman from Wisconsin consider withdrawing his request?
Anything the chair asks.
We'll get that in writing. Thank you. You can ask. There it is, okay. A working quorum being present, the vote is on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman...
Indicated there was going to be discussion when we came back.
The vote has occurred on the amendment, and we will now go to the next amendment.
Mr. Chairman, there was...
You said it was a pending discussion.
Record vote has been requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chairman,
we're going to call the roll on the...
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman will state his parliamentary...
When we left, the statement of the chair was that the amendment was still pending and that there would be discussion. We returned. Chair didn't give us the time for discussion.
The gentleman knows better than I that individuals on his side of the dais chose intentionally not to return, and we had a vote on the amendment, and the clerk will now call the roll.
Has the quorum been established?
Will the clerk call the roll, please?
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Sensenbrenner votes aye. Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes aye. Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Goodlatte?
Well, now they have the quorum.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Lundgren votes aye. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Pence? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks?
Aye.
Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin votes aye. Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Ross? Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. Quayle? Mr. Quayle votes aye. Mr. Amade? Mr. Conyers? Mr. Berman? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Ms. Waters? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley votes aye. Ms. Chu?
This is the Conyers amendment.
Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Polis?
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Pennsylvania, aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Marino votes aye.
There are other members who wish to be recorded. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross.
Mr. Ross votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman? Am I recorded, please?
How is the gentleman from New York recorded?
Mr. Nadler is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 24 members voted aye, 1 member voted nay.
Majority having voted in favor of the amendment. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks, will be recognized out of order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for a moment here.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just wanted to try to explain to my friends on the minority side that this was a decision that I encouraged all of my fellow Republicans to accept the amendment. I want to go ahead and make sure everyone knows that I truly believe that we did no harm, nor did we do any insult to the leaders that we tied this bill to. We believe it was altogether appropriate. Susan B. Anthony's pro-life credentials are absolutely clear in her writings. Mr. Douglas's comments I've quoted in my opening statement. And But I was afraid that perhaps we might take our eye off of the real issue here. And for me, no matter what it may seem, I know that everything that is done in this place is suspect. But for me, my goal is to see us somehow in America open our eyes to the reality of what's happening to unborn children in the land of the free and the home of the brave. This does not reflect who we are. If abortion on demand is really who we are, then it's time to realize that all of those individuals lying out in Arlington National Cemetery probably died in vain. And I just am convinced that we are never quite so eloquent as when we decry the crimes of past generations, the genocides that have taken place before. We never seem to be so careful in how we parse out the realities. But we seem to be almost blind to great genocides in our own time. And today, every fourth child in America is aborted. 4,000 will die before the sunset occurs today in our country. And no matter what anyone says, when we close our eyes to that, it absolutely undermines everything that we are as a people. It undermines this notion that we are all created equal. It is a fundamental crack, and this nation cannot survive when its very foundations are stained by the blood of its own children. And I just somehow hope that the efforts here to try to step away from the title of this bill are seen in two lights. Number one, a genuine desire on my heart to focus on what the real issue is. And number two, a desire on my heart to invite you to look at the substance of the bill and to search your conscience and heart and to all of us have an inward reflection for what is really happening here. The reason that this bill was named the Susan B. Anthony Frederick Douglass Act in fundamental terms was because Susan B. Anthony fought for women's rights in a way that I believe honored the whole country. Frederick Douglass was someone that spoke into the heart of Abraham Lincoln and probably catalyzed the end of 7,000 years of dehumanizing another human being. And I'm just convinced, Mr. Chairman, that that's what the intent of this bill is to try to do, is to cause us to relook at this issue. And I would hope that somehow that we would do that and that we would realize the real question really is simply, does abortion kill a baby? If it doesn't, let's quit talking about it. But if it does, let's get together and change this. Let's remind ourselves who we are. And with that, I yield back.
Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
Would the gentleman yield to the gentleman from South Carolina before he yields back?
Certainly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from Arizona. I just wanted to say to the gentleman from Arizona, there is no one who has worked harder to defend the defenseless, to give voice to the voiceless, to be an advocate for those who do not have an advocate than you. And irrespective of the title of your bill, it is meritorious on the four corners of the document alone. And you are to be commended for your steadfastness and your character.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word. Ask unanimous
Gentleman
consent to
yields
speak out
back
of
his
order.
time.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler. Is
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order for a moment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Let me say to the members, I'm hoping that with one member having spoken on each side in regard to the amendment that has been
Mr.
passed
Chairman.
Nearly unanimously, then we can move on to other amendments.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
from New York is.
I'd like
I
to
won't
be able to
I won't take the
recognize.
5 minutes. I just want to say this. First of all, I want to express appreciation to the gentleman from Arizona for his gesture in agreeing to pass this amendment. And let me say, I do not have any doubt whatsoever as to the authenticity and the heartfelt devotion of the gentleman from Arizona to his point of view as he expressed it. And I don't have any doubt as to many other people having, the same point of view. There is a very fundamental disagreement in this country, in this Congress, and in this committee on the rightness of abortion, on the rightness of choice, et cetera, and I'm not going to debate that in this context right now. We do not believe it to be true, most of what the gentleman said. All I can say about the amendment is, and we will debate that in the course of debating this, and I'm sure many other bills, I think we do not know really, and the historical record really doesn't show us anything about the view of Frederick Douglass or Susan B. Anthony on abortions, frankly. Now, one can assume, given your own view, that of course they would agree with you, or I could assume they would agree with me because my views are as intensely held, but we don't really know. Be that as it may, I think it is wrong, to appropriate their name to one view, which we don't really know that they held, which today people hold very strongly and believe is moral, and so forth. But we should debate the bill on its merits. We should debate the bill on our different moral viewpoints on the whole question of abortion and choice, and leave heroes who are no longer with us to their own opinions. And that's why I appreciate that we're not going to deal with the history of Frederick B. Douglass or Susan Anthony. People can debate that to their heart's content, but it shouldn't really be put on the on a bill which many people oppose and which many people would think does not do honor to their name. Some people would think it does. I'm glad that we're not getting into that. So I appreciate the gentleman's gesture, and I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield to the gentlewoman from Texas?
Oh, sure, yes.
Okay.
I thank the gentleman from New York, and I thank the chairman for referring. I think I can add my comments as well. I've known Mr. Franks on this committee for a very long time and know that he has true commitment to this issue. But I want to raise several points, and maybe as we all think about naming bills, Mr. Franks will be sensitive to it. Susan B. Anthony is known as a suffragette, by and large, and Frederick Douglass as an abolitionist. And the question that I raise is whether anyone had secured permission or had inquired of any of their...
Would the gentlewoman yield? Is the gentlewoman aware that those names have been removed?
I am aware. I'm making the point in trying to speak to the sincerity of just as Mr. Nadler was. Anyone inquired of any of those family members as to whether this would give credit to them? The other part, Mr. Franks, is that as I look at the bill in its totality, and what you were, I assume, having Ms. Anthony represent the gender and having Ms. Frederick Douglass representing the race, an abolitionist was a very serious entity during one of the most horrific times of our eras. That is slavery, enslavement and killing, and the sometimes dastardly things happened to both mother and child just out of the fact that they were slaves. It doesn't equate to your intent, which is your right to discuss the issue of abortion and how extensive it is in this country. But in fact, my understanding is I see no purposeful attempt to abort babies of color under race. I don't know where your documentation has come from. And I see none as relates to gender. And I ask the question whether this bill is an international bill. If this bill is only domestic, then it seems that your thinking was misdirected. And if I might add, in the month of African American History Month, when I first saw the bill, I thought this was a salute to African American history. It is misleading, and I know that the names have been changed. I want to pay tribute to your sincerity, but it was offensive. It was offensive to me, and again, I can't see any documentation where people are aborting babies in the United States based on gender and race, and why this bill is even necessary. I yield back my time.
Chairman. The gentleman from New York controls the time. Does the gentleman from New York yield back his time? I assume that he does.
If the gentleman would yield.
I'll yield to the gentleman.
Gentleman from New York is, without objection, given an additional 1 minute.
And I'll yield to the...
I thank the gentleman. I appreciate Mr. Frank's support of the amendment, and I appreciate the efforts to tone down the rhetoric, but it must be said that to compare the number of abortions to the number of slaves who were killed is to compare and equate women exercising their constitutional rights to the slave masters and those who killed the slaves. That's not acceptable. Further, to suggest simply because the gentleman does not agree with the Supreme Court, and it is the gentleman's goal to strip away a woman's reproductive rights, that somehow the men and women whose bodies lie in Arlington National Cemetery died in vain for defending the Constitution and the nation that we love is also unacceptable. I appreciate very much the efforts that the gentleman made to tone down the rhetoric in agreeing to the amendment. But those kinds of comparisons are simply beyond the pale.
Would the gentleman yield for 15 seconds? I would just say to you that there was a time when the Supreme Court said slavery was okay too, and we had this discussion a long time ago, and somebody changed their mind. And I'm just
reclaiming my time.
Reclaiming
my time. If this is, Mr. Chairman, we can have this debate throughout this entire markup of this bill, but to suggest that because slavery once existed in this country, it is now acceptable for us to compare women who exercise their reproductive rights with slave masters who killed their slaves. I find unacceptable, but if that's the direction that this markup will take, I'll look forward to participating.
Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?
I will. I yield back to the gentleman from New York, to the gentleman. Sorry.
Will the gentleman from New York yield?
Do I have any time? I will then yield to the gentleman from Georgia.
Just for the record, I think it should be stated that the Frederick Douglass Foundation is a one-man band, apparently, founded by Timothy F. Johnson, Ph.D., who is also the president. It's a political organization because it says on the website, we believe in the sanctity of human life and the protection of traditional marriage. And it's also a devoted Christians, proud Americans, active Republicans is what it stands for. And so this is this is owned and operated by a PhD, Timothy F. Johnson, whose PhD has been put in question. The man may not even be a doctor, but yet he is the head of the Frederick Douglass Foundation.
Will the gentleman yield?
I will.
Are you telling this committee that there's a front organization
Reclaiming my time.
with the name Frederick Douglass that is being used by a member of this committee who wants everybody to believe in his sincerity? And many of you members have honored him by saying that you believe his intentions are good, and now you're telling me that he's hiding behind a front organization?
Reclaiming my time. The gentleman has withdrawn his amendment. We've made the comments. I don't think that we have to, I mean, the gentleman has acceded to passing the amendment. The bona fides of the Frederick Douglass Foundation, which tell you right up front they're a conservative political organization, I don't think we ought to debate that anymore. Anybody can make of them what they want.
Well, just for the record.
I'm glad that the amendment has passed and this is not on the bill anymore.
Okay.
I yield back.
Appreciate the comments by the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Watt.
I ask unanimous consent to speak
The
out.
gentleman moves to strike the last word and is recognized for 5 minutes.
Let me just say this, Mr. Chairman. To the extent I started the escalation of emotions on this issue, I regret. Many of the members who have served with me for the entirety of my service in Congress know that it wasn't unusual for me in my early years in this body to be a lot more, how should I, in your face than I have tried to become. I thought I had turned that corner. Every once in a while that somebody pushes the wrong button or pushes the button. I shouldn't say the wrong button because that's a judgmental term. Pushes that button, and that member of Congress who's still there, who still believes in the things as vigorously as he did, but tries not to express them in the same way, that person comes out every once in a while. I think we should get on with the consideration of the bill. We've passed the amendment. I appreciate the gentleman and others who voted for Mr. Conyers' amendment. It doesn't resolve all of the concerns that people have about the bill, but at least we can turn our attention to the substance of the bill as opposed to Yeah, well, if there is any substance of the bill, as my colleague says, as opposed to the name of the bill. So, having said that, Mr. Frank and I had a discussion on the floor. I got some of my emotions out, and I'll apologize to him privately for some of the emotions that I expressed to him on the floor, but for now, let's try to get on with what we're here for and focus on the content of the bill, whatever the motivations for it might be.
Would the gentleman yield?
Thank
the gentleman
No, I
yield?
think I'm going to yield back my time and encourage us to get on with the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Watt.
Chairman, I've been raising my hand since before we left for the break.
Thank you,
I'd
Mr.
like
Watt.
to get out
I was hoping everybody would heed Mr. Watt's comments.
Well,
No.
Yeah, I will heed them
don't care what Mr.
after I
Watt says.
finish downloading.
Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The reason why this continues is because it's such an egregious act to misappropriate the name of a dead man who happens to be a hero who stood for certain things, and to go back and revise that that history, that legacy, for purely political purposes, is what's objectionable to me. I know that Mr. Frank has very strong beliefs in terms of abortion and whether or not it should be legal, and I respect that. But what I'm taking issue with and what I want to emphasize is that we should not ever misappropriate a name and link it to a political cause without having obtained any consent from family members of the person whose name is being misappropriated, without having any evidence that the person whose likeness and name is being misappropriated actually stood for the concept that is being promoted by the misappropriator. This should never happen. I know that it can happen, but I think that if it does happen, you're subject to the same kind of hostility that Mr. Watt exhibited with his objection to it, and I appreciate his objection. I had a couple of amendments. One was to change the name of the bill to the Ronald Reagan Impose Your Beliefs on a Woman's Womb Act. And I thought that since Ronald Reagan was a conservative, Frederick Douglass was a liberal, he wanted to change things. Ronald Reagan wanted to keep everything as it is, so he would have been opposed to Frederick Douglass in that time. And he's certainly more of an appropriate figure to name this bill after, since he wanted to keep government off the backs of the people. And so we want to get government out of a woman's womb and let the woman make the decision. And so I was going to pursue that. That's amendment number 6, which I hereby withdraw. And also amendment number 7, which was to strike the name and replace it with the name "The Tea Party Determines What Rights a Woman Has" Act, which would certainly be appropriate. But based on what has happened, I think that this amendment would also be moot. And so, therefore, I will withdraw it, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me make sure I'm clear. Mr. Johnson, you ask unanimous consent that those two amendments, number 6 and 7 on the roster, be withdrawn?
I do.
Okay, without objection, those two amendments are withdrawn.
Mr. Chairman, down this way.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, is
Yes,
recognized.
unanimous consent to speak out of order. And
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'll be very brief. The gentleman has just more or less taken Ronald Reagan's name in vain and said that had Ronald Reagan been around back in slavery times, he'd have been for slavery. I don't think that's the case. Ronald Reagan was responsible for freeing millions and millions of people who were behind an iron curtain, living under conditions which may not have been identical or even necessarily all that similar to slaves in this country, but he was responsible for making the lives of an awful lot of people on this earth a whole lot better. He was also a labor leader, as you might have known, early in his career, and he was a Democrat early in his career. Later on became a Republican, and had early on apparently been pro-choice and changed his mind about that, just other people have, and became strongly pro-life. But I don't think there's any indication at all that had Ronald Reagan been around during the times of Frederick Douglass, that he would have been a supporter of slavery.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
In 1980, candidate Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for the President of the United States in Philadelphia, Neshoba
Reclaiming
County,
my time, I know
Neshoba
exactly
County,
what you're going to say.
Alabama,
Reclaim my time.
Mississippi.
Regular order, the gentleman from Ohio
Yeah,
has
just
the
reclaiming
time.
my time. This old canard about Ronald Reagan having announced his campaign because it was a Klan area. I mean, that's a scurrilous hit on.
Why else
on
would
one,
he?
Excuse me, I didn't yield at this time.
Would the
That's
gentleman,
just-
would the
that's
gentleman
just-
yield?
I will in a second, but it's just a scurrilous thing to say about Ronald Reagan.
Would the gentleman
He doesn't
yield?
deserve
I
it.
mean-
He would have just been 101 years old just recently, and I just don't think it's appropriate for you to be
Would the gentleman-
essentially indicating that Ronald Reagan would have been against the
Would the
ideas
gentleman
of
yield?
Frederick Douglass and would have been a supporter of slavery. That's
Would the
just
gentleman
way
yield?
below the belt, especially
would
a
the
guy.
would the gentleman
I said I
yield?
would in a minute, okay?
Would the gentleman not interrupt the gentleman from Ohio?
I'm
He
going to yield
controls
in
the
just
time.
a second, okay? And I was going to be relatively brief, but I didn't realize you were going to drag up the Klan and try to wrap that around Ronald Reagan's neck. That is below the dignity of something that ought to be talked about in a committee that's as important as the one that we're here today.
Would the gentleman
Basically,
yield?
the legislation we're talking about here, and it always does bring up emotions on both sides, because we're talking about this side protecting innocent unborn children. And I know folks on the other side tend to be pro-choice, and the folks on this side tend to be pro-life, and it does get emotional. But there's no reason to bring Ronald Reagan into this and try to, tie him into the Klan. I mean, that's just absurd. And
Would
try
the-
to say he would have been for slavery. Just not true.
Would
I'll
the
yield.
gentleman please
I'll
let
yield.
yield?
I'll yield.
Yeah, I said he probably would have opposed Frederick Douglass, and I believe that that's based on evidence. First,
reclaiming
the use
my
of,
time,
the use of the Southern strategy.
Reclaiming my time.
Second,
If you
Gentleman
look
from
at-
Ohio, the gentleman from Ohio has the time.
I mean, if you look at a previous Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, he was the one, obviously, that actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation and was much more, if you want to look at Ronald Reagan, I think he would have liked to modeled what he stood for around Abraham Lincoln
Mr.
and
Shabbat,
the
would you
ideas
yield?
of Frederick Douglass
Would you yield,
than
Mr.
the
Shabbat?
Klan.
Would you
I'd
yield
be
to me?
happy to yield to either the gentleman from North Carolina or the gentleman from Georgia.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me because I think your reaction to Mr. Johnson's statements are exactly the same reactions that we had to Mr. Frank's putting the names that he did on the bill. So I think it illustrates the exact concerns that we were expressing, and I'm happy to know that I think that point has been made. In other words, and when you take people who are deceased, Ronald Reagan, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and you try to attribute motives to them in today's time, there's a lot of speculation going on.
And just, I understand.
But it's offensive, and that's why we reacted
and-
the way we did originally.
Thank you. I understand. And just reclaiming my time, and again, obviously, when you're talking about slavery, a despicable institution, both sides would agree, and I understand you know, the strong feelings on both sides about that issue, and many of the folks, especially on this side, feel just as strongly about abortion in this country, because we think those little innocent unborn babies also deserve to be protected and deserve the right to life. And the emotion, obviously, we feel strongly about that. My time's out. I'll yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr.
The
Chair?
gentleman from Arizona is recognized to offer an amendment.
Mr. Chair?
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman, I
Chairman?
have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman,
If the
have-
gentleman will
we have
withhold the amendment.
members with unanimous consent requests.
We're going to have a number of amendments, and could I encourage the members to take time on those amendments to make whatever comments they want to?
Well, yes, and I respect that, Mr. Chairman, if I may, but we're feeling this now. And this is a moment and a time when we have been
Is the gentlewoman going?
undermined, where we have been disrespected in such a manner that it causes us to want to engage on this issue. So with all due respect for wanting to move the debate, and I have an appreciation for that, I think it would behoove us to talk about this some more. Let's not try and gloss over this. This is extremely serious, extremely important, and I would beg your indulgence.
As I say, there will be ample opportunity for members to make any number of comments because of the number of amendments that we intend to take up. Could I ask the gentlewoman to make a comment in just a minute, and let's at least have this amendment considered?
Yes, but don't expect me to.
We don't.
Don't expect me to apologize or to talk about civility at that point, all right?
Fair enough. The gentleman's, the clerk will report the gentleman from Arizona's amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 3541, offered by Mr. Franks of Arizona.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Arizona is recognized to explain the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment responds to the concerns raised about the position of ASRM in the findings of the bill regarding the position of the American medical community. The original language of the bill is exactly accurate, Mr. Chairman, but we are willing to amend the language with this more lengthy and explicit explanation of the position of ASRM and the ACOG and the APLOG. The amendment statements of a working paper by the President's Council on Bioethics, and I'm going to read just a portion of the text proposed in the amendment for maximum clarity. I won't read it all, but the amendment, people are certainly welcome to read it, because all it really does is just lay out the entire commentary from these groups. Quote, the American medical community opposes sex selection. The American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, commonly known as ACOG, stated in its 2007 Ethics Committee opinion, number 360, that sex selection is inappropriate because it, quote, ultimately supports sexist practices. The ARSM 2004 Ethics Committee opinion on sex selection notes that central to the controversy of sex selection is the potential for, quote, inherent gender discrimination and the, quote, risk of psychological harm to sex-selected offspring by placing them on them expectations that are unreasonable, and, quote, the reinforcement of gender bias in society as a whole. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop there, but I would encourage everyone to read the entire amendment, because this lays out in explicit detail exactly what ARSM's position on this bill and upon the issue itself of sex selection is, and I would urge the adoption.
The gentleman yields back his time. Are there members who wish to be recognized in support or opposition to this amendment? The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Waters.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition, but I would like to engage the author, Mr. Franks, if he would enter into a colloquy with me on this bill, because I need some information about this amendment.
Certainly, I'll do my best.
Nowhere in this amendment does it define for us the extent of this problem. I have been trying to figure out the origin of your legislation, and additionally this amendment, and what documentation you have for sex selection and abortion. And I've not been able to find anywhere any statistics that causes you to bring this bill and this amendment before us? If you have such information, could you share that with us? I yield to the gentleman.
Well, thank you. Yes, the University of Texas has a study that shows that thousands of girls and unborn girls in this country have been aborted because they're little girls, and we'd be glad to add that to the findings of the amendment to this amendment if it would be of any help to you.
What year was this research done?
This would be 2009.
And this is the Department of the University of Texas?
This would be the Department of Economics at the University of Texas.
And this was not one individual who happens to be employed there who did this study rather than the university itself?
The name of the person that was in charge of the study was Jason Apravaya, if I hope I said that right. But I'd be glad to give you the entire study, and there of course...
Well, no, if you don't mind, I'd like to know whether or not the individual did this study as an individual, or did he do it under the auspices of the university?
We'll try to get that information for you.
It's very important because I don't want to be misled about and have this committee believe that this is some legitimate study that was authorized and supported by the university.
There are also studies done under UC Berkeley, that conservative bastion in California, and the University of Columbia that also support the findings of the bill.
Well, since your information and background and understanding of Frederick Douglass left a lot to be desired, I cannot take for granted that what you're saying without documentation and whether or not you can represent that these are individuals as opposed to the universities is good information. So I hope that prior to the close of this committee, you will present us with some facts and some documentation, and I yield back.
And would the gentleman yield?
Staff tells me that they'll be glad to get that.
I will yield to the gentleman from Atlanta.
Thank you. Mr. Franks, I'd also like to engage in a short colloquy with you. With respect to the studies at Columbia, Berkeley, and University of Texas, and subject to the admonitions that have already been made by my colleague, Ms. Waters from California, assuming that those were university studies, did any of them link opposition to abortion specifically to their sex selection findings? In other words, did they conclude that sex selection practices were tantamount to an abortion restriction, or that a restriction on abortion was needed? Was that the conclusion of any of those studies?
Mr. Johnson, I'm having a little trouble divining the actual question, but I will say that the conclusions of these studies were very clear in that it showed that sex selection abortions do take place in this country, and that highlights the reason for the bill in the first place.
So it's sex selection as the reason for abortion, you're saying, was the purpose of the studies?
The studies showed that there were individuals, families that were aborting little girls because of a son preference, and that there was no way to avoid that statistically, and that this bill would make that practice illegal.
Time of the gentleman is
reclaiming
expired.
Reclaiming my time, that if there is such a study, it is not about anything that happens in the United States, and you need to clarify that. If there was such a study, it's about studies relative to foreign countries. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time of the gentlelady is expired.
Mr. Chairman, to respond, there are many foreign countries, you're right, but these studies all talked about what happens in the United States of America, our country.
Chairman, I'd strike the last word.
Okay. Okay, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank, would you yield for
How
a
do you get the
second?
gentleman from Tennessee?
Yes, sir.
This paper,
Would the gentleman, I'm sorry?
I was just saying, how do you get the gentleman from Tennessee?
Because he had his hand up, and now, if you'd like for me to, would you yield to the gentlelady for 5 minutes? Then we'll go to the other side and then back to you, Mr. Cohen.
Sure, I yield.
I thank the gentleman from Tennessee. I'll just have to get a more visible eye contact. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the gentleman from Tennessee. So I have an amendment coming up after Mr. Frank's amendment, and I wanted to pose, I do want, Mr. Frank, if I could, I do want to secure the report from the University of Texas, because I think that is vital in understanding the genesis of this work. It would have been helpful, and I know this comes under the Constitution Subcommittee, I believe. Is this not correct?
Yes, we did in fact hear this bill in the Constitution Committee and presented that data at that time.
Right. And so for the full committee, we're sort of lacking in that information, and I'm not sure how quickly this legislation has moved. I might say that I know that I'm looking forward to several pieces of legislation that a number of us on this side of the aisle have introduced, would like to see it going forward. But I think the reason why I'm disturbed is because the bill seems to be hanging on, not ignoring your personal and deeply abiding faith and commitment to the issue on a thread of information. It doesn't seem to be a widely known proposition, if this is a domestic-based initiative, to see that there is sex selection among those who have made a determination through whatever tragedy it is to have a pregnancy termination. It seems like you're mixing apples and oranges. Part of this may be dealing with different isolated pockets of the United States where someone thinks that they're building their family on this premise, but this is not related to how you have it characterized, which is that individuals who have found themselves in difficulty and because of the law allows them choice, allows them to make a determination to terminate their pregnancy, that they are going in and seeking to know the sex and saying, yeah, it's a girl, go for it. I don't think we have that basis. And even as you claim that you have clarified the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and their ethics report of 2007, and when we're speaking in these times, 2007 is 5 years ago, again dated, 2004 is more than 8 years ago. So I'm a little concerned about this reference that no person from the American medical community is here to explain what this opening statement says. The American medical community opposes sex selection, and I'm sure they do, but to say it in the context of a bill that suggests that we are doing sex selection in abortions. That's the dilemma that many of us have about the bill and about your clarifying amendment. It doesn't clarify it because it doesn't give any sense of truth to using these major entities to believe that when they speak that they're not making generic statements, they're not speaking to the question of women having to choose in difficult times, making very personal and difficult choices. So I'll be happy to yield in just a moment. This amendment takes language seemingly out of context. It's ... the risk of psychological harm to sex-selected offspring by placing on them expectations that are too high. Who's going to disagree with a generic statement like that? Where did it come from? What was it in the context of? And reinforcement of gender bias in society as a whole. I don't think there's one member of Congress on this side of the aisle who does not have strong credentials on fighting for gender equality every single day of their life. I don't understand why we're in the midst of this language as if there is an indictment of all members of Congress or the whole society adhering to embryo sex selection. And then you go on to say, in quotes, I assume this is a quoting from somewhere, and reinforcement of gender bias in society as a whole. We have just passed pay parity. We have we have seen, and I think everyone here voted for it. We have seen women run for president of the United States. Happily so, it has been party equality. We had a woman run for president in the United States, and a Republican, unfortunately, was rejected by masses numbers of Republicans, unfortunately, but we appreciate her offering herself. And we had an individual running for president as a woman during 2008, who everyone remarkably noted that she ran an extensive campaign, and she ran it with the respect of voters from all sexes. So I am unsure of the language itself, Mr. Frank. If I have an additional minute, I'd be happy to yield.
The time of the gentlelady
If you
has
give me an
expired.
additional minute, I'd be happy to yield,
Passed.
Mr. Frank. But I conclude by saying that I'm troubled by this language in and of itself, its attribution, and I'd like the full report of the University of Texas. I oppose the amendment.
Time of the gentlelady is
Mr.
expired.
Chairman.
Mr. Lundgren.
Thank you very much. I just might say, incidentally, a condition precedent to income parity is life parity. It's kind of tough to have income if you have been selectively determined to be the subject of abortion because of your sex. The fact of the matter is the United States is one of the few developed countries that permit sex selection abortion on demand. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that most of the European Union countries specifically have complete bans or restrictions on sex selection. We in the United States Congress have condemned sex selection abortions in China by way of congressional resolution. In 2007, the United States government spearheaded a resolution in the United Nations calling on all member states to condemn or discourage sex selection abortion. And I hope the gentleman from Arizona will make this available to those who preceded me in speech, in that there are reports, newly released studies from the University of California at Berkeley, UC San Francisco, the University of Texas, the University of Connecticut, and Columbia University's Department of Economics. Now, if anybody doesn't believe that sex selection abortions are taking place, frankly, they live in a parallel universe. The data is uncontrovertible. Now, if you want to see what the ultimate conclusion of that is, look to China. China, because of a one-child policy, has probably exacerbated the unfortunate cultural inclination to select men over women or boys over girls. And what has happened now is in China you have perhaps the greatest example of a disparity between males and females we have ever seen in modern times. That brings up a whole set of questions. When you have, I believe the numbers are like 20 million in terms of the disparity of men within the age of those who would normally start families versus women, what does that do to a society? What does that do to the militaristic bent of that society? What does it do to that society as it deals with countries outside of it? And what does it ultimately say to women? If at the time of birth, a decision is made, or just prior to birth, that a male is far worthier than a female, such that you will destroy the female only because she is a female, what does that say ultimately about, not income parity, but what about the parity of worth, the value of the individual, the value of a woman as equal to the value of a man, the value of a child, whether male or female? As the father of two girls and one boy, and more girl grandchildren than boy grandchildren, I would resent any suggestion that those girls are any less worthy than the boys in my family. And you may argue about whether or not this is the appropriate vehicle. That is, do you want to have civil and criminal penalties with respect to these acts? But to suggest that the underlying facts are not true is I wouldn't say appalling, but is mind-bending. The facts are out there. If you don't believe this is the case, how do you explain what happens in other countries outside the United States? How do you explain we, the United States, through our government, condemning those countries that allow for sex selection by abortion? Disagree with the bill in terms of the manner in which it is enforced. But to suggest somehow that the underlying facts, and then to question, your reference to the American College of Obstetrics when you're quoting directly from their findings, is extraordinary. I can understand why some people believe that this is not the proper remedy to a problem, but I find it very difficult for people not to believe or understand or respect that this is a problem. Suggestion is that son, S-O-N, based sexual ratios in the United States Census would give you an idea of what might be occurring here. It's not just this country, it's happening in other countries. I happen to think that's a tragedy. I happen to think it's the ultimate insult to women, and it's particularly, if a culture accepts this, then you should be surprised if a culture does not then put women in a lesser position than men. It starts at the very beginning, that is at life. And I just hope that the debate would be focused on whether this is the appropriate vehicle for addressing this problem as opposed to questioning whether this problem exists at all. And with that, I do.
Would the gentleman yield? The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, is recognized. Then comes the gentleman from Illinois, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Franks, yield.
Yes, sir.
In the findings here, it says that the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists say that sex selection is inappropriate because it, quote, ultimately supports sexist practices, unquote. Is that the reason why you brought this bill?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cohen, I hoped that we could find some common ground, even on a committee like this where we're so polarized, that even though it's been difficult over the years to discuss protecting the unborn as opposed to protecting, the freedom of a mother to do as she chooses, I understand that there are two very powerful rights there, but protecting the unborn is a more fundamental right because it's actually the life of the child. And I know that we're going to argue about that, but at least it seems to me, and if you think I have a bigger agenda here, you're right. I want to see all unborn children protected, regardless of their race or their sex. I do. And I want to see somehow us to be able to find a better way to help mothers in crisis pregnancies than killing their children for them. Those are
the
true.
purpose of the basis
But
this is,
this
I reclaim my time, sir.
This bill is to try to make some kind of a
I'm
bridge
reclaiming my time, sir.
Okay.
So the bottom line is the fact that this is a sexist practice is not why you brought the bill. You brought the bill to outlaw abortion. And that's what you just said.
I brought the bill to find some common ground between very
all right, I'm
disparate
looking for common ground, too. What other sexist practices are you against that we can agree to work against?
I hope I'm against anything that would deny women equal rights under the Constitution.
Can you name me a few of the sexist practices that you're against?
I'm against any kind of, if a woman does equal pay for equal work, she should get paid the equal amount of money.
Lilly Ledbetter law,
No, I was not in favor of that because that did not do that.
And the equal pay for women law?
I don't know what the equal pay for women law, but I support equal pay for equal work, regardless of sex.
Okay. I yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would like permission to introduce into the record two documents that point out that Chairman Franks may have selectively quoted material that doesn't give the correct representation. One is from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, who sent me a letter to point out the error. And the other is from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And I'd like permission to insert these documents in the record without objection.
Without objection, the chairman will do that.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'm reclaiming my time. Mr. Frank, let me ask you a question here. What if a
Just,
lady...
just a minute, the ranking member has asked for something to be put in the record without objection. It will be.
I
so
ruled for
recorded.
you.
The gentleman from Tennessee.
The gentleman yield to the point of the
Let me
former
yield to
chairman?
ask you a question. What if a woman says at some point, I guess she'd have to say to her obstetrician, oh my gosh, I'm having a male, and I don't want to have a male. And the obstetrician says you can't do that and have an abortion because it's illegal. And what if she went to her husband and they said, you know, he can't do that. And he says, we can't have a child because we can't afford it, and we don't have plans for a child, and this is, we just can't do that. And if she went back, I want to have an abortion, he says, why? Well, we talked about it, we can't afford it. Are you irrevocably determined by your first statement, or is it best 2 out of 3?
Well, first of all, just to make it, to kind of get back to earth here, this bill says that you cannot discriminate against an unborn child by subjecting them to an abortion based on their sex or race. That's what the bill does.
Yeah, but your findings don't refer to child. Sir, your findings you handed out by the American College of Gynecology refers to fetuses, not children. And we're talking about fetuses here.
You know, I've heard the left called abortion retroactive contraception. They perpetrate monotonic polysyllabic obfuscation, semantic gymnastics, and verbal circumlocution because they want to hide what really happens here. Fetus is Latin for young one, and it means unborn child. So the bottom line is that's the big problem. But the secret to the universe here in this case is in the true naming of what is actually happening. We always want to hide the real issue. But to deal with Mr. Conyers' statement, I just want to know, because he was out.
I claim back my time. I just find all of this to be, and so much of what we've been discussing with the Coleman Foundation and all this is just shocking that since in 40 years, a woman's right and a man's right to participate in that choice is still under attack here in this United States Congress. And when jobs are the issue that the American public cares about, and jobs is the main issue, we're here talking about taking away a parent's right to determine when they have children or when they take a child to term. And this should be about jobs, and that's what we should be dealing with. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. Is there another member who wishes to be heard over here? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In an attempt to bring us back together, let me then try to paraphrase what Mr. Lundgren said, and without inaccurately, paraphrasing what he said, something about you can question whether this bill accomplishes what it seeks to do, but not whether or not sex-selective abortion takes place. I believe that's fairly accurate. So let me just do that for a second here to remind ourselves of that reality, because the experience of dozens of nations and healthcare experts around the world says this doesn't work. Banning sex-selective abortion has already been tried in dozens of countries across the world, and what expert agencies such as the World Health Organization, which operate in these countries, has found is that rather than preventing such abortions, the ban simply results in, quote, greater demand for clandestine procedures which fall outside regulations, protocols, monitoring, and basic safety, end of quote. In other words, rather than preventing abortions, such restrictions serve only to drive them underground, making them less safe. Our own history shows up this point as well. In addition, criminalization of sex selection abortions would force physicians to question women about the reasons for seeking an abortion. Well, I don't know how else they do it. And would likely compel physicians to target certain groups of women from cultural groups where sex selection is more prevalent. To avoid liability, physicians may even cease providing such care to entire groups of women simply because of their race and the preconceived notions expressed even here today. This bill would promote the very racial discrimination it purports to combat. Finally, targeting such motivations in practice would be nearly impossible. According to analysis, we're all quoting different organizations. Well, I'll try the World Health Organization on you and see how you feel about that. But according to the World Health Organization and 4 other UN agencies, quote, prosecuting offenders is practically impossible, and quote, proving that a particular abortion was sex selective is equally different, end of quotes. However, these experts, international organizations, do offer a viable solution to address this issue. Address the root cause, which is of sex selection, which is son preference. Sadly, sex selection is driven by a cultural preference for male sons and will only be ended when we commit to addressing its cultural roots. The United Nations has stated that the most effective way to address son preference is by fighting the root economic, social, and cultural causes of sexual inequality. There are things that we can do right here in this Congress toward that end. With all due respect, this bill doesn't do it. And it makes it even more difficult to address, of course.
Would the gentleman yield? I would just say to you, that argument could probably be made about any of the maladies in our society. I mean, we could say that we don't want to outlaw stealing. What we need to do is to get behind the root issue and find out why people steal. And I understand that you can make that about anything, but we still have laws against these things. And the idea that we would, for instance, that you mentioned earlier that the doctor would somehow have to ask questions. This bill does not require the doctor to ask any questions whatsoever. He has to know ahead of time. If he doesn't know, he has to knowingly do this, or he's not in any way implicated. Just like a pharmacist, if you go, or a doctor, and you go ask him to prescribe medicine for you, he doesn't say, well, are you going to give this to your husband and collect on the insurance? But if he knows that you're doing that, then he's implicated. But I just want to make it very clear that you can make the arguments about things like this, that somehow we need to get to the root cause, and I agree with you.
Well, sir, I just want to know, how would
the law protect the innocent.
How would the physician know in a real-world situation? Can you give me some examples of how this physician would know that a couple or an individual woman has made this decision?
You asked the right question. A person would have to tell them that the physician has no responsibility under this bill to ask.
So, knowing that this law is out there, what woman who wants to do this in the first place would tell her?
I think you make a good point, and it kind of goes along like this. I mean, you know, just because there were no murders in the Northwest Territory doesn't mean you don't have a statute on the books. The bottom line is, if you think that this never occurs, then this bill shouldn't be any concern to you whatsoever.
But just showing how far we are apart, a woman's decision to whether or not to go forward with having an abortion, it really shouldn't be compared to a person's decisions to murder somebody. It really shouldn't be compared to deciding whether or not to steal from somebody. Again, it just, with all due respect, shows just how far apart we are.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
There was some discussion about different studies. One of the studies that is supported by the University of California, San Francisco Joint Medical Program Research Fund, the Berkeley Human Rights Fellowship, and the UCSF Pathways to Careers in Clinical and Transitional Research Fellowship, concluded that the pressure to bear sons leads some immigrant Indian women to sex selection and abortions. And they were talking about the cultural pressures on women to do this. And I guess what I would say to the gentleman is, my quandary is, how do you have then counter pressures in the culture, or counter influences in the culture that would assist the women in resisting these cultural pressures that they are feeling? And again, this is a study done by the University of California, San Francisco.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman, without objection, has yielded an additional minute. Let me say that if we can vote on this amendment before we go to this series of votes, which has already begun, we will not come back after this series of votes. If we do not vote on this amendment, we will return after this series of votes.
Given that, Mr. Chairman, I relinquish my remaining time.
Okay. I thank the gentleman from Illinois. The question is on the amendment. All in favor of Mr. Frank's amendment, say aye. All opposed, say nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The committee will stand in recess until further notice of when this markup is going to resume. I am not sure yet whether we will resume tomorrow, but we will not resume any more today. So we stand in recess.